Have you ever just been flipping through a monster manual and come across a piece of art that made you say, wait a second, what's going on here? Throughout D&D's storied history, there are tons of creatures with show-stopping artwork that might give a reader pause, but there are very few who can match a SLAAD when it comes to weird vibes and a general sense of confusion. SLAAD are humanoid toad creatures twice the size of a human being with skin that ranges the entire spectrum of color. They have some of the most certifiably insane lore in the game's history, especially for such a staple creature, and today we're gonna dig into some of the least known bits of SLAAD lore and talk about not one but two species of SLAAD that never made it to 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. But first, context. SLAAD, like many iconic D&D creatures, were introduced to the game in the AD&D Fiend Folio published in 1981, and they are one of, if not the most chaotic creatures in the many worlds of D&D. I mean, they're literally an expression of chaotic energy incarnate, which is why they hail from the ever-changing chaos of Limbo. If you're not familiar with Limbo, it's ever-changing and chaotic. In our Grand Wheel cosmology, it is the chaotic neutral plane and is home to creatures such as the Githzerai and, of course, the SLAAD. SLAAD come in a pretty wild variety of shapes and sizes, but most SLAAD can be categorized by color into one of 5 larger groups. Red and blue SLAAD make up the majority of their kind, with green SLAAD being one rung higher on the totem pole, and they've got the ability to cast spells. Above them you have gray SLAAD, and sitting at the tippity top of the hierarchy you have the Death SLAAD. Now you may be thinking, wait a minute, death isn't a color, and to that a SLAAD would say, so what? As beings of pure chaos, they follow their whims wherever they may lead. Sometimes a SLAAD can seem perfectly friendly, only to turn on a dime and become aggressive seemingly out of nowhere. In their own skewed outlook on the multiverse, the only rule that should be respected is strength, and one's ability to enforce their will over other creatures. So when a SLAAD seeks to prove its strength in a violent contest against another SLAAD, to them, this is just the natural way of things. Conversely, if another creature ever bullies a SLAAD into doing something through force, they don't take it personally at all. They simply just see it as that other creature exercising their right to rule, so to speak. Now, of course, each individual SLAAD more or less thinks they're king of the hill, so it's not uncommon for a SLAAD to fight to the death over something most people would consider totally trivial. The result of this philosophy is that there aren't really any SLAAD civilizations of which to speak, just sort of roving bands of SLAAD who are loosely following the lead of the most powerful member of their group. This leads to a pretty high lethality rate for the SLAAD, but fortunately for them, and unfortunately for most other creatures, SLAAD reproduce rapidly. In scientific terms, their reproduction cycle is super fucking uncool. Red SLAAD deposit tiny eggs into living organisms through their claws, which eventually hatch into SLAAD tadpoles, or SLAADpoles if you will, who will then grow up into either red or blue SLAAD unless the creature was capable of casting magic, in which case they will become a green SLAAD. Straightforward, right? Makes sense. I mean, if you've ever seen Alien, you basically get the gist of it. The other way they reproduce is actually through the blue SLAAD, who don't inject eggs into their victims with their claws, but rather mutate other living creatures into SLAAD with their claw attacks, which is arguably less disgusting and lethal for the victim, but still pretty uncool. Gray SLAAD are the first example of SLAAD evolution in that they are mutated individuals who used to be red, blue, or green. This mutation into a gray SLAAD can occur in one of 2 ways, the first of which involves an object called the Spawning Stone. Let's talk about the Spawning Stone. The Spawning Stone is a flat slab of rough stone that is about a mile long and 3/4 of a mile wide. Its surface is coated in esoteric runes that are only legible to the SLAAD and an unfortunately high amount of viscera and gore. The stone itself is an item comparable to the Shard of Ultimate Evil in the depths of the Abyss. However, instead of being this focal point for vile energy, it is an object of pure chaos. The reason it's smattered with blood is because when SLAAD mating season arrives, a time period that operates on intervals which are impossible to track unless you're a SLAAD, all of the SLAAD of one type will usually meet at the stone and reproduce, which often ends with a lot of new tadpoles being created, and a ton of violence. Sitting atop the center of the stone is a massive iron throne upon which sits a death SLAAD who will kill basically anyone approaching the stone that isn't themselves a SLAAD. As a focal point of pure chaotic energy, the spawning stone can sometimes mutate a more mundane SLAAD into a gray SLAAD, making them much more intelligent and much more dangerous. The other way for a SLAAD to mutate into a gray SLAAD, or for a gray SLAAD to become a death SLAAD, is through the influence of a SLAAD Lord. SLAAD Lords are the most powerful SLAAD to exist. Full stop. Each one of them is a unique individual that has been changed and mutated through exploring some unique avenue of chaos that no SLAAD before them has been able to harness. Upon becoming a SLAAD Lord, the SLAAD in question mutates into a form that might look SLAAD-like still, but may also look nothing like a SLAAD. A great example of this is the first SLAAD Lord, who became the Lord of Insanity and appears as a brain suspended in a gelatinous body with multiple pseudopods. Think of the SLAAD Lords as being similar to Demon Lords in the Abyss or Archdevils in the Nine Hells. They're not gods, but they hold power that is beyond comprehension for most other creatures. There are only 8 named SLAAD Lords that we know of, but there are theoretically others who have not made themselves known beyond the confines of Limbo. However, we know there aren't too many of them, primarily because of Yagorl. While Sendam, the first SLAAD Lord, may be the eldest and most powerful SLAAD, Sendam also has no interest in what the SLAAD are up to at any given time, and is more or less just a force in the background focused on their own inscrutable goals. Yagorl, on the other hand, is the SLAAD Lord of Entropy, the second oldest of the SLAAD Lords, and is more or less the king of Limbo. I mean, SLAAD don't really have kings or any system of government at all, but Yagorl is out here doing ranked competitive tyrant activities. Yagorl not only created the spawning stone, but is also on this grand crusade to unmake the multiverse, or at least that's what most people think. Truthfully, his motivations aren't super clear beyond the fact that he seems intent to destroy everything around him, but what is clear is that he has a vested interest in directing the SLAAD as a species. He's not out here building armies or anything, but he tends to choose champions to act as shepherds that guide the SLAAD down one path or another, and those champions are, of course, the Death SLAAD. Yagorl also has an interest in keeping the number of SLAAD Lords contained to a minimum, mostly so that other creatures from distant planes can't learn too much about the SLAAD Lords and how they might be created or destroyed. So most SLAAD who ascend to the status of SLAAD Lord are immediately killed by Yagorl, which is why there are so few of them in the first place. But with all of that said, we've now seen the SLAAD life cycle from Tadpole to Tier 1 SLAAD to Grey SLAAD to Death SLAAD, and that's the extent of most people's SLAAD-based knowledge. But humanoid toad enthusiasts everywhere will be pleased to know that there are in fact 2 more species of SLAAD that continue this chain of evolution to a lethal degree. When a Death SLAAD manages to survive for more than a century, they sometimes feel an overwhelming urge to isolate themselves in a secluded location. Provided that they remain absent contact with any and all sentient creatures during this time, the SLAAD will return from their isolation as a white SLAAD, which marks a change in their abilities and an incredibly dangerous amount of power. White SLAAD are sometimes called Chrono SLAAD because they have this ability to see into the stream of time, both past and future, and they can glean insights that should be impossible. They can also summon copies of themselves from future and past timelines to aid them in battle if things ever become desperate. And should a white SLAAD ever manage to survive for over a century, much like the transition from Death SLAAD to white SLAAD, they can undergo a process that transforms them from white SLAAD to black SLAAD, which, barring the SLAAD Lords themselves, is the apex of personal power an individual SLAAD can ever hope to achieve. Black SLAAD are said to be hand-picked by Yagorl to aid in his entropic crusade against creation, and they possess abilities to match this destructive ambition. An individual black SLAAD is on a power level comparable to that of some ancient dragons. Each one is a blot of entropy on existence itself, causing anything they touch to wither into ash. While still maintaining the general silhouette of a SLAAD, black SLAAD are in no uncertain terms something much more dangerous than their other kin. The Nine Hells has Pit Fiends, Mount Celestia's got Solars, the Abyss has Baylors, In Limbo has Black SLAAD. As the arch-villains of their respective domain, they are obviously capable of some insane stuff, but before we get into the specifics of all that, I gotta give a massive shout out to this week's sponsor, Arch-Villain Encounters, Death and Beyond. This project is genuinely so cool, and I think a lot of you guys will love what they've got on offer. Arch-Villain Encounters, Death and Beyond is a series of 15 individual D&D encounter boxes. Each box is built around a mega boss. It includes a huge, highly detailed PVC miniature, a 50+ page adventure book, which contains an adventure built around the boss, information about their lair, their history, adventure hooks, minion stat blocks, creature tokens, item and spell cards, and a dry erase battle map of the villain's lair. It is literally everything you need to run an amazing adventure all rolled into a single box. They even include multiple stat blocks for the boss monster so it can be used in multiple tiers of play, which is excellent. They sent me a sample box containing a Necrolon, the dragon who consumed the cosmos, a dragon who became consumed with the need for understanding, which drove him past the brink of insanity. Everything in the box is really high quality, and this miniature is absolutely sick. I cannot wait to paint it and see the look of horror on my players' faces when it lands on the table. All of the molds for the miniatures are ready, the artwork is done. They are basically just running this crowdfunding campaign to actually get everything made, which means if you do decide to pick up 1 or 2 or all 15 of these villainous boxes, you can expect to receive them within 7 to 8 months, which ain't too shabby. Backers are also getting a deal on these boxes, meaning that you will be saving yourself some cash if you place an order now instead of waiting until they are set into full release on store shelves, and the more boxes you order, the deeper the discount. More cool monsters, twist my arm. The funding campaign to Arch-Villain Encounters, Death and Beyond is live right now on GameFound, and if you back it before 7 p.m. on May 16th, you can get access to some free dice and minis exclusively available to early bird backers. So follow the link in the description down below and check it out for yourself. Maybe pick up 1 or 2 or 15 heinous villains to unleash on your adventuring party. Thank you once again to Arch-Villain Encounters, Death and Beyond for bringing us here to talk about some arch-villains of our own. Speaking of which, we have an entropic hole in reality to check in on. Both the Black and White SLAAD first appeared in the Epic Level Handbook for D&D 3rd edition, which, as the title implies, is filled with epic level stuff. So the jump in power from a Death SLAAD to a White SLAAD is pretty significant, seeing as Death SLAAD are CR 10 and a White SLAAD in my conversion clocks in with a challenge rating of 18. In 3rd edition, they are more or less a juiced up version of the lesser SLAAD before them, but in 4th edition, they were reprinted with some extra spice, where it is explained that White SLAAD actually have the ability to mess with time. So while I didn't actually take any mechanical inspiration from the 4E versions of this monster, I really liked that as a concept, so I decided to include it with my 5E conversion. Makes them a little different, which is good. Like all SLAAD, they have magic resistance and regeneration. I also gave them a primary attack that is basically just an improved version of the primary attack that you'll find on the Grey and Death SLAAD stat blocks. The White SLAAD version, of course, does more damage, and in addition to sometimes causing charmed, frightened, poisoned, or incapacitated, their attack can also cause the target to become stunned or petrified. Pulled straight from the 3.5 stat block, we've also got the Entropic Spittle attack, which deals some acid damage and coats the target in slime, which slows them down, causes acid damage every round, and that effect lasts until 10 minutes goes by or it is cleaned off. They've also got a slew of nasty spells like Fear, Finger of Death, Disintegrate, Circle of Death, and Power Word Stun, and the ability to cast Mirror Image as a bonus action, which is more or less them rippling between time streams. They also have an ability called Summon Self, which allows them to summon a copy of themselves from the future or the past. This essentially creates 2d4 copies of the SLAAD, which all get their own turn on initiative, and of course, they all share the same hit point pool. So this ability isn't going to drag out the encounter by giving your party 8 more dudes they need to cut through, but it is going to make things a lot more dangerous until they can, get through the single hit point pool of a single White SLAAD. Moving over to the Black SLAAD, we see all of those same SLAAD traits, of course, including the powered up Chaos Rend, but this is now a CR 24 creature, so it's gotta have some nasty tricks up its froggy sleeves. Toady sleeves? I don't think it even has sleeves. For starters, I gave the Black SLAAD an ability which all SLAAD used to have, but hasn't been in the game since 5th edition, which is the ability to summon other SLAAD to help it in combat using Summon SLAAD. This is a random chance to summon 2d4 green SLAAD, 1d6 gray SLAAD, 1d4 death SLAAD, or 1d2 white SLAAD, which can hang out for an hour before being sent back to Limbo. They've also got a gnarly spell list which includes things like Power Word Kill and 9th level Disintegrate. So that's fun. And of course there's the ability to destroy magic on contact, so I gave them a reaction that is more or less counterspell, except they regain hit points equal to the level of the consumed spell slot, as long as it wasn't a cantrip. But speaking of destroying magic items, the Black SLAAD also has an ability called Arcane Destruction, which is an action that targets an object such as some armor, a weapon, or a piece of equipment. For my 5e conversion, I made this work basically the same way as the Rust Monster's degrading ability, except that it can affect magic items and objects, which is guaranteed to strike fear into the hearts of players around the table. You've never seen player fear until the Paladin's Holy Avenger suddenly starts to degrade. Also at this level, you almost need something that can threaten more than just the player's hit points, and a new breed of SLAAD, I think, could be just the thing. But aside from the terrifying things both of these new SLAAD variants can do, the question, as always, is how do we use them at the game table? At their most basic, just having a black or white SLAAD in the back pocket to incorporate with your otherwise SLAAD-focused adventure is kind of nice. But I also think that the sort of unknown nature of these rare SLAAD variants can be a plot hook in and of itself. Maybe the party is being paid by a researcher or sage of some kind to go to Limbo and try and find proof of a white or black SLAAD's existence. Or maybe they're trying to spy on a death SLAAD who is on the cusp of becoming a white SLAAD so that they can learn what the process actually entails. So much about these creatures is shrouded in mystery, and like the SLAAD lords themselves, they generally like it that way. A white SLAAD can also be a great villain for a campaign where the party's patron is a god of time or order, or even an order of worshippers devoted to a god of time. The party might have to set out and find the source of some anomaly in the flow of time, only to discover that it is being caused by a white SLAAD who they will either need to destroy or convince to return back to Limbo. This could actually be a ton of fun. Perhaps the white SLAAD's presence is warping time in the area so severely that a small forest has become this overgrown jungle filled with weird, highly evolved animals. Or perhaps it's turned a bustling town into a blighted ruin, ruled over by a villain who won't technically be born for another 500 years. It could even be a situation where the white SLAAD's presence is messing with some kind of prophecy. Perhaps a threat that wasn't supposed to present itself for another 1,000 years is now suddenly here, and the white SLAAD is to blame. Limbo, the home of all SLAAD, is also a really important place to a lot of different factions in the multiverse. It connects to some very important domains across the many planes of existence, and the party being connected with any one of those factions who has an interest in Limbo could lead them through Limbo and therefore into contact with the SLAAD. SLAAD society is borderline solipsistic in their outlook, meaning that a lot of SLAAD don't really consider anyone or anything but themselves to be real. In some cases, literally. Most SLAAD acknowledge other SLAAD, but anything or anyone from other planes of existence is thought of as more or less a dream, which also explains a lot of their behavior. And all of that is just to say, if one of the SLAAD lords ever decided to act on this notion and try to expand Limbo into other planes of existence, a campaign where SLAAD are the big bads could be really interesting. That would be really tough to run as a DM because SLAAD are so disorganized by design, but I think there's room for a bit of organized chaos that could make a really neat campaign premise. I also think the idea of a black SLAAD who is on the cusp of becoming a SLAAD lord is a great character to center an adventure around, either as an antagonist or an ally. Perhaps one of the other SLAAD lords is doing something that will cause mass destruction on the material plane, and the best way to stop them is to help a black SLAAD to ascend into this position of SLAAD lord and use their newfound power to stop this other force. This could be a wild journey through unhinged SLAAD society, which I think sounds awesome. But however you choose to run this monster at your table, no matter what you want to do, In the description down below, you will find a link to my 5th edition conversion of the SLAAD stat block for both the black and white slots, as well as the new artwork that I had commissioned for them, created by Tam, who did a fantastic job. And if you are one of my lovely patrons over on the Dungeon Dad Patreon page, you'll find all the same information wrapped up in a nice fancy schmancy high-res PDF stat block as my way of saying thank you to you guys who throw some extra support my way each month and help keep this channel running. Speaking of which, this week's randomly selected patron of the week is ndubs103. Thank you so much for the extra level of support you provide me each month. And thank you for watching. As always, if there's a monster from a previous edition of D&D or some other role-playing game that you would like to see show up in a future episode of Monster of the Week, let me know in the comments down below, or in the Discord server in our Creature Suggestions channel, which is also linked down below, and you might just see it show up in a future episode of Monster of the Week. I had a ton of fun researching for this video. SLAAD are absolutely wild. They're a very goofy, bizarre, and strange cast of monsters, and I sincerely hope you enjoyed hearing me ramble about some of the weird Eldritch Frog guys. If you've never had a chance to use SLAAD in an adventure, whether black and white SLAAD or just the SLAAD in general, I highly recommend you at least give it a shot sometime. It is a very fun group of creatures to run as the primary force driving an adventure, and I think every GM should